As Aaron said, I'm Madison Schmalzer. I'm going to be talking about gender and video games here. My socials are there if you'd like to follow me while Twitter continues to exist for maybe a brief amount of time. You can find me there or email me. And I guess before I even get into this, I kind of want to acknowledge something. I'm going to be talking about transness, transsubjectivity in relation to video games. And a part of me, in light of, I guess, horrific kind of anti-trans violence that's been happening over a large course of time, but especially in the past few days, I don't know. Feels kind of uncomfortable sometimes to talk about video games at a time like this, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I talk about here are linked back to some of these larger political, societal issues in a more serious way as well. So this is just an acknowledgement that I'm giving this talk and I'm kind of aware of these things and I'm sad and angry about them as it's happening. And I'm trying to sit with that and work and figure out ways to work with and through this. So with that out of the way, let me get into the actual talk. So what I'm going to be presenting today is kind of a collection of ideas that is kind of from a few different projects. They're going to partially be derived from stuff I've been working on through my time at North Carolina State University's Communication, Rhetoric, and Digital Media program that ended up being my DIS, Transition Games, Speedrunning, Gender. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in this routing the run section here, but I'm going to be shifting into some other ideas surrounding the kind of societal rules that go into video game play, the temporalities then of trans identities and video games and how they inflect on one another. And I'm going to end off on some ideas surrounding glitch later. And I first want to mention that dissertation that this will be partially derived from. And as the title of that work suggested, that was about gender transition as well as games. It was a call to transition games, that is to change them, to take the rules to make them something else, which is something I find inherent to speedrunning. In changing the rules, the hardware, software, and embodied relationships to games are altered as well. Orientation towards play become transformative. At the same time, the subtitle was Speedrunning Gender, and that allowed me to take the critical lens that speedrunning afforded me to rethink games and turn it back on other systems of rules, like gender. How do we speedrun gender? This has little to do with going fast. Speedrunning, after all, is a long, slow process. I instead ask how speedrunning, as a process and collection of practices that transforms games, can become an orientation towards gender. How do we take gender's rules and warp them to our desires? And in doing so, how do we alter the metaphorical hardware and software gender operates on, as well as our embodied relationships to gender? That project was in part an autoethnographic accounting of my time speedrunning and transitioning. It was a grappling with my own gender, as well as an investigation into how gendered subjectivity becomes entangled with technology on a personal level, specifically that technology being video games, and even more specifically, the particular practices with video games that constitute speedrunning. So this is all to say that I actively speedrun whenever I'm afforded the time. And I'm using my streaming layout here. That's what this purple and pink is. That box on the left is generally dedicated to my splits that you'll kind of see how that works in a little bit. And I view playing video games and taking part in communities surrounding them to be a kind of method in and of itself, in a similar way as I view the alterations to my body and presentations to be a research method as well. So that project was really a merging of those two things. And I'm now removed from that particular moments, the early days of transitioning that produced that work. And my thinking has been pushed in various ways by other projects I'm working on, such as one with my co-author who's on the call here, P.S. Berge, on what we are dubbing vectors of desire that are particular trans orientation towards play that unmakes game worlds. Also, I've been moving in other directions through engagement with the work of and conversations with scholars such as Whit Powell and Ariana Gass, who have been theorizing the glitch as a trans mode of existence that has a lot of overlap with the ways I've been thinking about things. So I want to mention upfront that this project is a part of what I and a coterie of other scholars would call trans game studies. I hesitate to firmly define trans game studies broadly. It's clear to me that many scholars have very different takes on what it looks like, from focuses on trans representation to the ability to express the trans rage through play, to playing with glitches and undermining firm ontological conceptions of bodies, to playing with identity in digital spaces, and the list could go on. The only real unifying feature to trans game studies is the care for and centering of transness in game studies. It also seems clear to me that the exigence for this is in some ways a reaction to queer game studies, even if trans game studies is indebted to and tightly entangled with queer game studies, which I'll talk about in more detail later, but it's a recentering of transness in these discussions. So with all that preamble out of the way, I want to start with how am I thinking about speedrunning in relation to transness? And I'm thinking of it through two different ways. One is on the layer of metaphor. I argue that the practices of speedrunning become a metaphor for the practices of transsubjectivity. Speedrunning, and play more generally, becomes a way to understand, articulate, and imagine transness. But over the course of this talk, I also want to think about how video game play practices become a kind of trans embodiment themselves. It's not just a way to imagine and think about gender or transition. It's a way to actually do it, to produce new bodies and new subjectivities. And we need to talk a little bit about what speedrunning is, though. There's cultural conceptions of it. You might be familiar with it from just being in video gaming communities, but I want to drill down into it a little bit before we get into this. And a kind of a radically incomplete definition of speedrunning comes from Speedruns Live, being playing a game with the intent of completing a goal as fast as possible. And as far as definitions go, that's an okay one. It tells us what it is. It gestures at some larger concepts. For example, the goal. What is the goal? We need to set goals according to player desire that we'll talk about a little bit. As fast as possible gestures towards iterative testing and communal practices. But these things are only gestured at this definition. So what I call speedrunning is a technological practice that's rooted in communal histories that emerge from specific technological configurations, along with player desire that create and indexes orientation towards game and community formations. This emphasizes the active labor that goes into producing speedrunning, as well as the merging of cultural and technological practices that gesture towards communal historical trajectories and materialist modes of engagement. But what does that look like in practice? Well, oftentimes it doesn't even look like playing video games. It looks like something like this, like a Discord server, where there's many people have invested, many invested players coming together to share strategies, to form community, to form relationships, and sharing all that information together. And the moderation that goes into creating that place that is safe for them to do so. It looks like the decentralized leaderboards that communities operate, which while foster competition, also foster a lot of community formation, because once you have a leaderboard, all runs are shared publicly. I can see everyone else's runs. Strategies are shared and mutually talked about. There's no hiding anything in these competitions. There's always a push to drive the time down and become the best that they can. It also looks like categories and rules, communally forming the rule sets for how we play, which are labeled categories, which are going to be something that are very important going forward. And when we finally get to the games, they look a little something like this. Where I'm speedrunning Undertale, I skip all this text that I can't read anyways because it's in Japanese. I perform these quick movements to then skip dialogue and narrative, often in dramatic fashion. The entire worlds of games are completely ignored. There's an old proverb in speedrunning that walls are only suggestions, as I just clip out of bounds here and glide to the ending of a level. The entire world of games are reconfigured through this orientation towards play, wherein the narratives, diegetic structure, none of it matters anymore. We have a completely different understanding what the system itself is. And finally, this clip of me running Hades here, fighting the final boss. Hades is a notoriously difficult game. This might look like an impressive feat to any of you that have played this and tried to fight the final boss and failed, but to me, I watch this and I see the small sub-optimizations, particularly right here, where I missed some rockets. You probably can't even notice. There's so much noise on this screen, but I am concerned with the 5 seconds or so that I lost on this fight. I don't care that I'm going to win it. I care at the optimizations. And this is going to be important for speedrunning going forward. I'll let myself beat the final boss real quick as I give up a Death Defiance. And there. It doesn't matter that I won. It matters that I didn't do it quite optimally. So speedrunning then understands video games as raw materials to produce play that adheres to players' desire. My desire to go fast, to be optimized. It's similar to Bullock and Lemieux's usage of the term metagaming. Speedrunning is in part a refusal of prescribed interactions with games. Instead, new rules are mapped onto the materials of games, reconfiguring orientation towards hardware and software, and producing new ways to play that can alter our orientations towards temporality and even our understanding of rules themselves. I make a connection here. In the same way, various technocultural practices that produce speedrunning, so too are there a litany of material, historical, communal practices that produce contingent constructions of transness. Transness is itself constructed through the labor of many people, through technological interventions, and through reconfiguring of societal rules. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this contingent construction of gendered subjectivity is not at all unique. It is the way that gender and sex both work writ large. For example, Susan Stryker in her 1994 essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, Performing Transgender Rage, she says, "Hearken unto me, fellow creatures, I who have dwelt in a form unmatched with my desire, I whose flesh has become an assemblage of incongruous and anatomical parts, I who achieve the similitude of a natural body only through an unnatural process. You are as constructed as me, the same anarchic womb has birthed us both. I call upon you to investigate your nature as I have compelled to confront mine. Heed my words, you may well discover the seams and sutures in yourself." I'm fond of the term technogender that Paul Preciado uses to describe this, the ways in which biopolitical regimes create subjectivities through technological interventions such as pharmaceuticals and pornography. But I'm less concerned here with what Stryker gestures at and Preciado does with dominant subjectivities. I'm interested instead in Stryker's use of desire and assemblage of incongruous anatomical parts. Historically, the production of transness has been a project of working against hegemonic structures that don't allow for our desires to unfold. So we must take it upon ourselves to stitch ourselves together, so to speak. This is a refusal, even when we are all to beholden to normative society in so many ways. From having to conform to cisconceptions of beauty so that we can move through the world safely, to navigating bureaucratic and medical systems that don't take us into account, to the mundane act of interfacing with technologies like the TSA full-body scanners that can't account for trans bodies, we're all too aware of, in Whit Powell's words, the mediation by cisnormative societal norms. Speedrunning is one way to perform unmediation through video games. And I want to quickly mention here as well that speedrunning has been analyzed by queer game scholars already, and connections have been made between the two. I draw from P.S. Berge and my draft here of some other work discussing Bo Ruberg's analysis of Gone Home, which speedrunning Gone Home, I should say, which illustrates some shortcomings of queer orientation towards speedrunning. Ruberg argues that speedrunners of the game Gone Home straighten the game by refusing to slow or wander or engage the game's queer narrative, but acknowledge that there is something queer to speedrunning routes in that they resist normative, pre-designated paths through the game. Ruberg's frustrated analysis emerges in part because taking the optimal or fastest route through a game suggests normativity as well. Speedrunners hone a particular path through a game to shave off fractions of a second on their runs. Locating queerness then becomes an exercise in determining what path is more normative than another. There's a focus on normativity and non-normativity here. One becomes more radical than the other, which does not really take into account a trans perspective and is difficult to even map onto speedrunning. Normativity is a fraught term for trans people that are mediated by so many systems that are out of our control and that we exist in uneasy tension with. To me, while there's some power to thinking through the ways that game spaces and play become altered so as to imagine new ways of being, it also misses much of both the act of speedrunning and transitioning. So with that going forward, I'll be focusing on trans desire and the ways that it becomes mediated. In other words, to use Powell's terms, how something like speedrunning is a process of unmediation. And in doing so, I'll attempt to uncover trans temporalities through play in an effort to trans games. And with that, let's talk a little bit about one form of mediation that becomes important for trans lives: rules. Rules are obviously central to games. A whole host of game scholars have conceived of rules as almost definitional to games. Additionally, at a larger scale, Foucault demonstrates the ways that rules become categories by grouping like things. They also govern the internal structures of those categories, prescribing the behavior. Crucially, there's what Foucault calls a hidden network that forms these categories: gender, woman, sex, normal. All of these categories are more organized and subsequently controlled by rule sets that, by and large, are left unexamined by most. Keeping them unexamined maintains their power. However, these invisible rules become very important to those that don't want to or can't play them. An example: Mackenzie Wark opens gamer theory with this set of questions that reads in part: ever get the feeling you're playing some vast and useless game whose goal you don't know and whose rules you can't remember? Ever get the vague dread that while you have no choice but to play the game, you can't win it, can't know the score, or who keeps it? Wark calls the world as seen by the gamer a matrix of endlessly varying games. And the use of the term matrix is a direct reference to the movie, that very same name, which the character Morpheus gives Neo a speech very similar to Wark's questions. Gamer theory and the Matrix were written by trans women, and there is something particularly trans in the persistent nagging feeling that we're playing by rules that don't quite fit how we want to play. It is hard to put a finger on what this is if we aren't fully aware that there are rules at all. It's hard to directly see standard rules for what they are, and it's impossible to critically reflect on our desires for new futures when we don't understand we're playing a game. But what is the game we're playing? One of these invisible games is a struggle over the rules themselves. So let's shift to the morning of October 16th, 2021, when the Twitter timeline was blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, with a thread that I'll let Shadow the Hedgehog recite the beginning of here. So take it away, Shadow.
You can't catch me. I'm the fastest thing alive.
I was thinking about why so many in the radical left participate in speed running.
Huh?
The reason is the left's lack of work ethic.
What?
Go fast rather than do it right, and in a Petersonian sense,
Petersonian?
to elevate alternative sexual archetypes in the marketplace. Fastest hedgehog.
Shadow, what the fuck are you talking about?
You're a beta male, Sonic.
Excellent. That was likely very confusing for most, for more than one reason. One of them being connecting leftist politics to speedrunning, and I will assure you, reading the entirety of this Twitter thread won't clear much up for you. Although it did coin the delightfully nonsensical term fully automated luxury communism that I now use in my day-to-day speech. What this is a thread by a self-described anti-feminism / SJW member of the manosphere, who over the course of 16 tweets in which they liberally cite transphobic Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, links playing video games fast to wokeness, the radical left, and communism. But I suspect these typical far-right punchy bags aren't really what are at stake from this person, nor many other people who make similar claims. This thread is turned into meme videos in part because of the ubiquity of these kinds of arguments. Yeah, sure, dude. Speedrunning is for woke, beta cucks, whatever. We've heard it a million times before. So I take this thread as emblematic of many attitudes in gaming communities that attempt to circumscribe correct and incorrect modes of play. The actual genesis of these common attacks lies in the fact that speedrunning undermines the ontology of video games. The current standard rule set for video game culture is actively hostile to a wide swath of people. And ensures the place of privilege for white, cis, hetero, able-bodied men. Policing the rules of interaction with the video games in turn maintains the stability of the rule sets that surround video game culture. There's a large-scale game being played out over the past few decades wherein many players are attempting to define the rules of certain categories to define video games, video game play, and video game players, something that the depressingly relevant history of Gamergate attests to. These kinds of policing of boundaries is seen from TERFs, that is, trans exclusionary radical feminists who use the same tactics of harassment as we see in gaming communities as similar rhetorical moves to violently police the boundaries of gender. For example, J.K. Rowling's infamous TERF Wars blog post, where she lays out her case for why the trans rights movement is dangerous, but we can use her pun as illustrative here. The case against trans rights for Rowling and others like her, including the fascists she and others like her are in bed with, such as Daily Wire commentary Matt Walsh and Chaya Rychik, aka Libs of TikTok, who openly call for violence against trans people, is the redefinition of boundaries. One of their core strategies is digging their heels into the standard rules, and in doing so, take part in similar moves of harassment we've already seen in game communities and amongst the far right. But let's take a step back and think about the generation of rules in speedrunning communities. Firmly defined rules are essential to speedrunning. We don't have runs unless we form categories. But we notice something peculiar about the rules in speedrunning. They're malleable and open to change. What speedrunning categories really are is an indexing into the desires of players. They're arbitrary. This picture I have here is from the Hades speedrunning leaderboard. And you'll notice across the top, there's many categories that have proliferated over time: any heat, 32 heat, 40 heat, etc., on down the line, 3 weapons, all weapons. But I want you to notice the unmodded and modded categories here. Players took it upon themselves to say that the game did not meet their needs and their desires for speedrunning. The game was altered, it was modded, and those modifications came from much debate, much discussion, and much care that went into ensuring that there was a rule set that was fair and allowed for many people to participate. What I find that's really interesting is after these mods have been produced, just a few days ago, another conversation has started, how there's still shortcomings in other ways that people want to play. The formation of a hyper-modded category is currently underway with much debate, many polls, and a lot of discussion amongst the community. Just because there's a category in speedrunning does not foreclose the creation of more categories or the changing of existing ones, and that's very important. I want to illustrate this and to connect it back to transness specifically and the creation of rules behind it. I want to play this poem by Narcissa Wright. She is a speedrunner of Legend of Zelda, 3D Legend of Zelda games, particularly Ocarina of Time. And this poem that she recites over the ending of one of her runs of the game, as you'll see, connects a lot of the ideas around how we create rules and categories and how we can shift our orientation towards them to be more liberatory, specifically through using speedrunning as a metaphor. So I'm going to play this. It's about 2.5 minutes.
As OOT90% shifts back to VCJ, my mind wanders to the S adapters, and to the virtual console that doesn't crash when GIM is performed, and to the old Kakariko route, resetting the console to save time, and to the timing method, the arbitrary start and end points. My mind wanders to the homebrewed Wii, the region-freed WAD, to the replacement joystick, to the Hori mini-pad, to the rubber band, tape, and grease. My mind wanders to the practice, the process, the save state, to the Game Shark, the Game Saver, the Gecko code, to the cheating, the splicing, the policing, the audio waveform. My mind wanders to the timer, the inconsistency, the dropped frames, to the bitrate, the capture card, the interlacing, to the emulator, the graphics plugin, the dead zone, the dead zone. The S adapters are subtle, invisible, already in use. I see the grand decentralization of it all. My mind wanders to the IQ player, the fast memory card, the old GameCube laser, to the PS2 disc speed, the sloppy port, the HD remaster, to the PAL cartridge, the patched glitch, the Japanese text speed, to the turbo controller, the rules. All the categories are arbitrary. Perhaps Marsupial said it best. Do whatever you want, there are literally no rules. The futility of it all, the statistical waiting game, grinding endless attempts, waiting for the outlier, never enough, suboptimal, improvable. My mind wanders to the RNG, the frame-perfect timing, the human error, to the attempts, the streams, the splits, to the audience, the shit talk, the clicks, the fame. My mind wanders to the traveling, the marathons, sexually harassed, fleeing, hiding, reclusive, paranoid, getting high, playing Smash, destroying my wrists. My mind wanders to the life I poured into it all, working in a frenzy, managing a community, disrupting speedrunning, building upon it something new and greater. Then it fell in upon itself. Gianna saw it first. I was foolish. It couldn't be unified. All the categories are arbitrary. Finished painting my nails, doing my makeup, put on some mascara, roll up my thigh highs. All the categories are arbitrary. Slip on a skirt, buy a new dress, feel the pain from the laser. All the categories are arbitrary. Leaving the clinic, bottles in my hand, spironolactone, estradiol. All the categories are arbitrary.
So I want to dwell on that poem for a second. My mind wanders serves as a kind of a refrain. The poem is a reflection on speedrunning as a large community, speedrunning as a personal practice, Wright's role in speedrunning communities, and how her personal transition fits into all of it, and how transness and speedrunning reflect one another. Her mind first wanders to a detailed accounting of the hardware, software, and glitches that go into creating an Ocarina of Time any percent speedrun. The listing highlights the ways that the run shifted over the years, incorporating new discoveries and tricks that require different hardware and orientations towards the game. Through these shifts, language develops, such as abbreviations like GIM, which stands for Get Item Manipulation. This term takes on meaning within a particular community of practice where it indexes not only a technological configuration or manipulation of software and hardware, but also a shared history that Wright traces. The language of speedrunning is not just the abbreviations or indeed the words themselves. The development and implementation of GIM, as well as the development of rules surrounding it, are contained within this acronym. Similarly, the old Kakariko root, the homebrewed Wii, or the fast memory card take on historical, emotional, and strategic significance for runners. The communal history and language comes about because of the category, Ocarina of Time any percent. It is the category, the rule set, that gives meaning to this collection of objects. A legibility comes from shared rules and categories. The rubber bands used to lock a joystick into a precise position, the minute dropped frames, the rate that a PlayStation 2 disc spins, the speed at which Japanese text is written to a screen all become meaningful and legible within the history of Ocarina of Time any percent speedrunning. But about halfway through the poem, there's a change. She abruptly exclaims, "The rules, the rules." Her mind wanders to the rules, as it inevitably does for any speedrunner and trans person. Once speedrunning understands rules as arbitrary, it can shift. As she muses, I see the grand decentralization of it all. There may be disagreements, there may be dangerous factions that need to be guarded against, there may be fracturing and multiplicity, there may be violence, there may be personal risk and pain, and as Wright mentions, there is immense harm that she sustained over her years in the speedrunning scenes. The arbitrary categories are not inherently liberatory or freeing. There are rules and cultural practices that are outside of our control. We are mediated, after all, and it takes an immense amount of labor and care to create, manage, and maintain any one category and to keep those within it safe, at least as best we can. A tremendous amount of work goes into establishing categories, containing rules that serve those that are interpolated into them, as well as forming a space of legibility for players to come together. But that work is how we develop some kind of productive counterpower. She ends her poem shifting away from speaking about speedrunning to her own transition. Her mind no longer wanders. This last part is spoken in the moment and seems to be built from the reflection she has had on speedrunning. She connects the work, dangers, hardware, software, and rules of speedrunning directly to her own trans identity and the technologies and pharmaceuticals that produce it, while also making a parallel between the two via the repeated invocation of arbitrary categories. Speedrunning for Wright becomes a glitch in the categorical rules of video games, in the same way that her transition glitches and plays with arbitrary categories of gender. Speedrunning and the glitches inherent to it becomes a language to understand transness through and a means to create new modes of relationality, no matter how tenuous and costly those relations may be. And transness becomes a new kind of language and means to make herself legible, just as Ocarina of Time any percent is. So speedrunning is often characterized as a kind of violence, wherein the world's narratives and scripted sequences are destroyed, torn apart, or done away with via the use of glitches and obsession with speed. And this is not dissimilar to how transness can become deployed in some feminist and queer theory, as well as more nefarious circles, as a tool that dismantles gender. And I want to push back on these conceptions. There may be some destruction, but first and foremost, from the raw materials of a video game, the hardware and software primarily, a new way to play is created in the same way that the materials of gender, bodies, clothing, mannerisms, relationships, laws, cultural assumptions, and so on come to be reconfigured to create new gendered subjectivities. Sure, we may smash things over our metaphorical knees, but we create something new from the fractured pieces as well. So I understand speedrunning then to be a way to unmediate video games, to take the mediating rules of capital G gaming and undergo the labor to produce alternative ways of play that adhere to the desires of those that are playing. And I've gestured towards the ways that these rules produce alternative ways to engage with the material of video games, offering us glimpses into the ways that trans subjectivity can be produced through play. But I want to shift to talking about temporalities here. Speedrunning is all about speed, right? Going fast and optimizing movement. Yes and no. This conception of speedrunning is based on the fact that most people's engagement with the practice comes from seeing fantastic feats that they're the top of leaderboards, the first, second, third places that we see, and featured at major events like Games Done Quick. This, to me, is not dissimilar to conceptions of transness that are reinforced with media artifacts like before and after and trans timelines. They show us starting in one place and ending up fully realized at a stable identity elsewhere. But this is all kind of bullshit. We never end up stably anywhere, and there's a lot of work and time that goes into producing those images. Nothing could be that simple. And I want to focus on the reset. What's pictured here are my splits for Hades modded 3 weapons. That is the times of my previous runs, this being my personal best times. And you compare yourself against these as you play. You'll notice, though, that up in this top corner, I keep track of how many times I've attempted this category. At this current moment, as in this morning, I am at 838 attempts. I've ran this category 838 times to try to improve it and get better. I've only completed 85 of them. This is what we call a reset. We start over with the run. If you aren't on pace for any number of reasons, bad luck, poor play, whatever the case may be, you start over from the top. You reset. It's because I'm interested in optimizing my play. If I'm behind pace, I terminate the run and try again. And it's extremely common in speedrunning. Runs are lost all the time. We start over again and again and again and again and again. It's a slog. It is slow. It's incremental. But each cycle promises a new outcome. We have hope for every new beginning. But there's no perfect run. We know this. It never happens. We can only strive towards something, always changing. And a part of this cycle is documenting runs and strats for others. Like these 2 guides that I just pulled some images from. We share our journeys and hope that other people join our community of people that are dedicated to continually failing, yet finding hope and joy and striving for an ever-deferred and always shifting goal. This is, I argue, a particularly trans orientation towards temporality. To reset is to start over, and isn't that what a transition is? But we don't wipe the slate clean. We build from where we've been, and we also build off of others' work. We break out of, in Elizabeth Friedman's terms, chrononormative temporalities through both our own and others' labor. And we often fail at this, a lot. My transition is a story of a lot of failures to move, speak, interact in the ways that I want to, but these cycles of failure are always moving towards a goal, the proverbial PB. The ever-deferred gendered presentation on the horizon that promises that I personally, and more broadly as a group of people, share a similar desire for a liberation move towards. And this image right here on the screen, I put, because it's a familiar one, that becomes emblematic of some of the things I'm talking about. This is my hormone levels from, I don't know, a few years ago. I don't actually know when this is from. I chose this one at random because it happens a lot. I get my blood drawn over and over and over and over in the same way that I get my face zapped over and over and over, in the same way I have to come out to people over and over and over and over. Small resets that are part of the larger reset of transition. But this image specifically shows the optimization. In the same way that my runs are oriented towards microscopic movements that lead into a successful run, so too am I interested in optimizing my body, of iteratively testing and changing the smallest of details, of tracking them over time and mastering this physical form that'll never be perfect, and sharing that information with other people, of asking for advice online from other trans people when a medical establishment doesn't give us the advice that we need. But let's put this more concretely into an actual speed run. This is footage from an old run of Spyro Reignited to any percent from a few years ago, where everything comes together for me and I reach my goal time. And this part in particular is the hardest part of this run. I entered this level and I paused. I confused the game to send me on a very specific frame somewhere else. I'm controlling Spyro behind this cutscene to enter another level, blindly navigating. Soon I'm going to pause, you'll hear it. And I'm navigating a menu. and I sigh. What I just did was, as you'll see after Spyro dies here in a moment, is I tricked the game into thinking I'm in a different level where there's power-ups, so that I can use those power-ups here to dispatch this boss very quickly. I then will use that to glitch into the final boss and defeat him, shaving off a whole third of the game. Now, the sigh back there after I finally did it, I think is illustrative. It's hard to see, but my splits say that this is attempt 212. I've reset on this extremely precise series of tricks 211 times to reach this point. In speedrunning, the vast majority of runs are reset because of poor RNG, bad decision-making, mechanical errors, and that accumulation of failure of starting over again and again and again helps reshapes orientation towards play, and they can shape our orientation towards other temporalities. And like I said, transition could be felt as a kind of a reset too. I really do get kind of emotional seeing myself in this video. I'm just beginning to grow my hair out. Yes, less than a year on hormones. I'm just beginning to start over, to cut through the dissociation that has maintained me through nothing but inertia, to do the work of trying again. And I don't know where any of the practices of transition will lead me. Just like speedrunning, there's so much RNG. What will I look like? How will my family react? How will this affect employment? And it's scary attempting to move on from the past. But practices with video games like speedrunning can allow us to embody alternative temporalities. The reset has changed the game and has changed me. On a physical level, I become attuned to the run. The run's temporalities are ingrained in my fingers and joints. A trans understanding of our bodies is one that recognizes them to be malleable. And I'm going to pause him. Well, I'm at the final boss. They are constructed technologies that connect with and incorporate other technologies into them. Speedrunning is one of those technologies for me. So as I change my body through pharmaceuticals and a whole host of gender technologies, speedrunning also changes me, but just not just in physical ways. Video game temporalities, like all media, come to bear on the ways we engage with the world and understand it. For me, speedrunning is a particularly trans-temporal mode. The temporalities of the reset that are so central to speedrunning have helped me reflect on the temporalities of my own life. On another level, transitioning changes my relationship to gender technologies, while speedrunning changes my relationship to video game technologies. But really, it's even more complicated than that, because speedrunning and transition are part of the same assemblage that make up my life. I cannot neatly segment elements of myself. So speedrunning can alter connections with gender, and so too can transitioning inflect on video games. And this last section is short. I want to gesture towards some ideas that I'm working with right now that build off of Whit Powell's argumentation with media glitches as unmediation. So I ask, how do trans people desync with the media that is our own bodies, forming some kind of stable or flickering subjectivity? Speedrunning and transness have been conceived of glitches in gendered subjectivity. We are mediated by the world around us. We don't quite fit into the systems we are interpolated into. We don't sync with the world or our own bodies, and we become glitches. How do these subjectivities then synchronize or not with the other media forms we interact with? Or in other words, how do we become cyborgs? Or how do we become glitched cyborgs? I use the concept of synchronization to describe how we come to control our bodies without lag, how the immaterial and material emerge to create subjectivities through media. I find identification, as it is used in video game studies, to be a particularly powerful concept to interrogate. Identifying with a character in a game can be powerful in that it allows for acting on our desires to be other. Interfaces presumably fall away, and we are unaware of bodies at screens or hands on controllers. We are transported, immersed in virtual worlds. But what about when we speedrun? There's a kind of telepresence, sure, but identification does not work in the same way as when we understand video games to be manipulable software. The representational space of player characters and narrative is heavily decentralized. Instead, we are interfacing with software and hardware, but even before that, we must interface with ourselves. Our own bodies become a piece of media we must interface with so that it can become an extension of our desire. And that synchronization is never perfect. Otherwise, we wouldn't have speedrunning. The errors in the RNG are what makes speedrunning what it is. If everyone was perfect, we wouldn't need to have the practice of speedrunning. So to transition is to grapple with uneasy synchronizations, to bring our bodies into sync with our desires. And extending that synchronization over time is difficult. There are glitches in the matrix. The difficulty is not the same for everyone, and often the difficulties stem from the matrices of gender, race, class, ability, and other forces. outside of our direct control. However, by incorporating and synchronizing virtual and physical technologies with our bodies, that is, becoming imperfect glitch cyborgs, we come to produce new kinds of subjectivities, new bodies, and new modes of living our lives. And I want to note that I'm still grappling with many issues surrounding these ideas. While I'm hopeful for the glitch as a means to create liberatory subjectivities, glitches are always indexed, fixed, eradicated, or rolled into existing systems as functions. And I would love to talk about that more in the Q&A, but I'll leave off with that here. Leave off with this. The technologies of video games and the games we play with them, like speedrunning, are one of many technologies of gender, and because of video games' engagement with synchronized cyborg constructions, they become a tool to enunciate, imagine, play with, and embody new forms of subjectivity. So, I said a lot of words. I'm gonna take a break and stop talking, and ask of any questions.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Madison, for this really, really, really profound and thoughtful and theoretically rich talk. I see Mar has their hand up. So I will pass to Mar first. But before that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. And if you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, you can always sort of drop a question in the chat. But yeah, so Mar, you can go ahead and start the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm glitching in the video.
Yeah, you're glitching good. That's fine.
In like attuned to the talk. So thank you so much, Madison. This was fantastic. Let's be friends, please.
Absolutely.
And I am also in video game studies, glitching temporality, but more at the queer side.
Mm-hmm.
So I really want to hear about glitching, that part that you just skipped about glitching and indexing.
Mm-hmm.
And please go off. I want to hear more.
Okay, yeah. So as I'm kind of thinking about this, really my whole talk here, even if it wasn't directly referencing it the whole time, was in some ways thinking about the ways in which certain bodies are glitches in the kind of normal functioning of society and how we do or do not slot into that. And oftentimes we have in queer studies, particularly in relation to video games, we think of glitches as this kind of something that gestures towards a new libertary future, something that can allow us to escape the mediation of the world around us. And I just gave a very long talk that kind of buys into that, and I really do find that profound as this kind of way to, at the very least, imagine ways to be other. What I was gesturing towards at the end, though, is how do we continue to do that? Glitches become indexed, right? Speedrunning in particular, my objects of study, we give names to them. For example, in the poem from Narcissa Wright, I talked about the get item manipulation, right? Now that this glitch is given a name, we know how to use it, we know how to initiate it, we operationalize it towards certain goals. Does it do the same work as it always did, or do we have to continue to find new glitches? I'm curious, and this is like an open question to the world and everyone out there, if there's always another glitch out there to find. If the work that I am doing and other speedrunners are doing are foreclosing opportunities for new futures by writing about these glitches. Once we know about the glitch, does it cease to become a glitch, or does it need that kind of moment of rupture, that moment of surprise to do the kind of work that we often talk about it doing? And that's where I'm at right now, putting those kinds of questions out into the world and seeing what other people think, because I'm not sure. And I want to balance both of those kinds of things while still attending to the care that should go into, how these glitches actually do work for people in the world, if any of that makes some amount of sense.
Yes, it's a way of, if you inject the glitches and you put them, you make them known, they become markers in the trail for other people,
Mhm.
so they can use glitches. But they can be, and also on the other side, they can be abused and used in ways that not only are unintended, but can be warped to create more problems than solutions.
True. I think I think you're right. It's very complex.
No, I'm just like thinking about it, how
Mhm.
sometimes vocabulary is just appropriated, and some forms and some practices are appropriated in ways that actually make the glitch less effective in a broader sense than more effective.
Yeah.
As in, when you have glitches and the glitch becomes very known in the game, it is fixed, or it's used in a way that that you cannot achieve the same thing anymore after an update or a DLC or the
Right.
next. That's
And I'll
why
say,
open are very, very popular with speedrunning, because they cannot.
yeah. And I'll say I see connections to, like, I guess, queer and trans politics more broadly, right? How we um, uh, say how we're interpolated into kind of capitalist systems, so that to become a market segment, for example, right? No longer a glitch. This identity has been named and understood and then operationalized, right? These are the kinds of things that I'm kind of trying to think about and make connections to. But yeah, I guess David.
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful, lovely, and sort of vivifying talk. As I am sitting here and listening to all of this rich information that has been given to us, I'm sort of really curious about any sort of work that you might have done either in the dissertation or in your own research or elsewhere about the sort of frictional nature of trans gaming, particularly in regard to something like disability or crypt theory, because the reason that I bring this up, one hand, is that on the one hand, I'm very interested in disability studies, disability media studies. On the other hand, there seems to me to be some really rich connections between these two corpus of theory, and also because you sort of mentioned at the end of this sort of talk about that very nature of the complicating and problematizing ideas of certain kinds of subjectivities, including disability, and particularly, I promise coming to the end here in a moment, but particularly what's fascinating about your talk, as I am sort of taking it in, is this question of temporalities, and also this question of fitness and the idea of the misfit, all three of which are really sort of central to certain brands of disability studies and disability media studies through people like Rosemary Garland Thompson, and through the sort of rejection of normative timescales through crypt time, as has been written extensively about. But at the same time, right, the idea of the speed run, of sort of teleological nature on the one hand, and also the notion of the reset on the other, it seems to be that there's some rich connections between these two things.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think trans studies and disability studies broadly speak to each other very, very directly in a lot of ways. And I think back to just the quote that I pulled from Susan Stryker about investigating the sutured nature of everyone's subjectivity, right? The ways in which that all bodies are constructed to fit a particular norm or a particular kind of whether it's gendered, whether it's in race, whether it's in relation to ability, right? Revealing that kind of production, that work that goes into it. And then I guess and elsewhere I've talked about then and I gestured towards it at the end, like I think you said, the word you used was friction, and I think that's really great, where now we see the friction for some bodies, some subjectivities don't quite fit into that. That's what the glitch is to me. And that's the kind of difficult space where glitch becomes a really troubled metaphor too, wherein it's something that does a thing that produces some sort of new kind of way to exist. But also often there's an impulse to eradicate it, right? And how do we make space for a glitch, and how do we avoid redefining it as normative and but also care for it? Is care for the glitch is something that like I'm kind of concerned with. So I think you're really right. I've talked about this in relation to what I call janky controls elsewhere, where there's a kind of unspoken rule in game development that inscribes how precisely we are supposed to interact with like physical controllers, right? And some games kind of buck that trend. They're janky, or intentionally or otherwise, whether it's designed in or it's just because they don't freaking work. I'm playing Pokemon Scarlet, and that's the case. The game doesn't work in the ways. And I talk about like how that reveals some of the sutures. The fact that normally some bodies can play games unhindered is a fact that their subjectivity has been produced, and games have been produced for that subjectivity to allow for that kind of game. So I'm trying to think about how we can also operationalize the glitch to kind of reveal that and bring that forth as well to speak to some of that. So those are some of the ideas that came to my head as you were talking. But I think you're absolutely right. There's so much that it can be crossed over, and some scholars have done that work. I think of Cameron Awkward Rich, who writes about the bad feelings of being trans, and he connects it over to kind of disability studies and how to sit with that, and how like to work through and work with those bad feelings instead of like dismissing them or heal them or ignore them or do some self-care or whatever, right? And how do we work with that? So there's this work happening, and I think it's really exciting.
Yes. So thank you. And just to sort of add a pin to the end of that, what's also fascinating to me is the ways in which we can sort of think about the desires to be different on a larger infrastructural level, and the ways in which that is being embraced and also commodified at the same time. So thinking about the ways in which, for instance, the Xbox game controller speaks to subjectivities in a way that disability has not been addressed in the past, but at the same time, it's a commodity that one buys and then feeds into the larger capitalist neoliberal structure of everything, and how one cannot find a way outside one's system. Anyway, I'm taking up too much time, and
no, that's great.
Thank you very much, and yes, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Mark, for those questions. We have one question in the chat, and so I want to read that question. It was from Brett, excuse me. So they ask, I'll just read it. They say, I know speedrunning is a very welcoming space for trans people. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the way that speedrunning as a literal trans space relates to your theoretical interventions.
Yes, thank you so much, Brett. So you're right to note that. Speedrunning is also located within, I don't want to like sugarcoat things. Speedrunning is also located in a larger games culture. So there are, pockets of the same old bullshit that you see everywhere, right? At the same time, by and large, it is much more welcoming because the labor and work that many people have undergone to make that space, to actively work against the anti-trans kind of sentiments that exist. Places like Games Done Quick have done an excellent job, in my opinion, of producing those spaces, but in smaller areas. The Discord servers and the policies that we're in that are put in place to boot people that are a problem, to make them safe. But to speak to like your question at the end, I do think there is something to the fact that many trans people are drawn to practices like speedrunning, that view the game and the game world as something that is constructed by them and can be reconstructed in different ways, in the same ways that our bodies can be altered, and these interventions that can happen with it. At least through discussions, not formal research discussions, but kind of talking to other trans speedrunners about this. It has come up more than once. And outside of speedrunning specifically, my dissertation, I kind of note a handful of different ways where media or other practices, from swinging a hammer and building fences to riding a bicycle, allows for different kind of meditations and orientations towards one's own body that allows them to feel it in different ways and grapple with transness. I think speedrunning specifically allows for a lot of that. It's extremely physical and embodied for video game play, and also does that tearing apart and kind of structuring of rules at the same time. But yeah, as a whole, speedrunning is a great place. And on top of that, most of my advice for like through my transition came from fellow speedrunners in Discord servers that were set up to allow for spaces not only talk about speedrunning, but talk about accessing medical care, going through the bureaucracy of all the stuff that you have to do. So yeah, like there are places where people care for one another and produce not only video game play, but these kind of mutual subjectivities. So thanks for the question, I guess.
Thank you so much for that question, Brett. We have one more question in the chat from Juan, and I'll go ahead and read that. So Juan says, I'm wondering if you can say more about speedrunning as a process of unmediating game worlds, especially in relation to what seems to also be a hypermediated engagement with games through the process of stream recording, run through recording. Another way to ask this is, do you see speedrunning mediation / unmediation as also creating a trans gaming archive of sorts?
Yes, thank you so much. Basically, yes, at the end there. So you're right. One of the things I adore, and I've been working with, well, PS is on the call here, working through this kind of idea of mediation that WPOW in various ways that WPOW kind of introduces us to. And a hang up that I've always had on it is like unmediation, as in deconstructing the norms and existing outside of them, always runs up against the fact that we are remediating in other ways. So we're never getting outside of mediation writ large. So you're right to put a finger on that. And that comes down to some of the problems I'm having with glitch, right? How glitch becomes reinscribed as a norm, right? We always just step into another kind of form of mediation. But that is what I was trying to gesture towards when I talk about the Discord spaces where people communicate and should share their thoughts. When I talk about the guides that are produced, right? When leaderboards become guides, they're not just leaderboards. We think of them as these competitive spaces, but they're archives of all the labor that people have put into to produce their runs and their speed runs. It's not about necessarily the top time, the second time. It's about the work that a community has done. And I do view that as this kind of archive. Now, whether it's directly a trans archive, I don't know, but it's a trans orientation towards it, of sharing communally all this research and care that goes into producing subjectivity. There's something particularly trans about it, which may also speak to some of the reason why there are so many trans runners. I think actually on basically all of those leaderboards that I showed you, it had a trans person who was both at the top time and multiple other trans people towards the top. So people are encouraged to get into this hobby through these, and I think it's partially because of that archival work. And it's not just about video games, like I said. There is fountains of knowledge about hormones, for example, in these spaces of accessing doctors and surgeries and things of that nature. So yeah, I hope that kind of speaks to some of what you're asking.
Thank you so much, Madison. If no one else has a question right now, I'd like to ask you a question. Oh, actually, no. Rayvon Fouché, he raised his hand. So Ray, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Ernest. Sorry, I jumped in on you there real quickly.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, thank you, Madison, so much for participating and giving a talk and for the Hat Lab. I have so many questions, but I'll just begin with a couple. So I guess in your work, so where does the completionist fit into your work and the project that you're doing? So is it oppositional to the speed running, or I mean, what is it just a different space location of engaging, interacting with gameplay?
Well, that's why I focus on desire, right? I'm not too invested in structures of normativity or anti-normativity necessarily specifically. It's another orientation towards play. In the same way that speedrunning categories proliferate based on player desire, in the same way gendered categories and presentations proliferate in this world, I want to think about spaces that allow for desire to both be unfold and be produced. So the completionist is just a different orientation towards the game, one that does generally accept the kind of diegetic and structural framing of the game as it is created by a designer. And I haven't necessarily kind of grappled with all the implications of completionists, but I have no truck with them. I have no real bones to pick with basically any way that people play. I'm interested in proliferating modes of play rather than kind of shutting them down in any capacity.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was meant that way, but just as more just think about way you're thinking about the interpretive flexibility of gameplay. And
yeah,
well, the completionist, right? You know, as a person who doesn't game very much, so you're gonna I'm gonna show my lack of knowledge here. So let me just kind of tiptoe very gently in there. So right, the completionist is about understanding and conforming to, in a sense, to the rules of the game. The way it's, in a sense, is generally structured. But you're talking about a different place of space where modding, freedom, the rule making is community based rather than corporate and based. So I'm intrigued about that as an opposite, as another space to think about this question that you're raising. And then I'm curious to think about how you distinguish between these terms, like optimization versus perfection versus glitch in the context of speed running. Again, a question from basically no information, no knowledge whatsoever. But as you're talking, those are the things that kind of were popping up in my head. It's like speed running is it about optimization or this goal for perfection, even though I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah. So starting with perfection, that term. So I think something that comes up, and this is why I say playing the video game is like a method of research. When we look at speedrunning, it seems like it's about perfection. Going as fast as possible was in the literal definition. But you realize quickly that perfection will never happen. You will never be perfect for a myriad of reasons. One, because we're people in bodies with limited time on this earth is one of them. One of them is games don't do what we want them to do. We want to wrangle them into our nice, neat playing, but it won't happen. It's this quest for perfection that's always deferred. It's always on the horizon. We're pushing towards it and we're going, and it is our goal, but we know that we're never going to get there. So we try to optimize things to the best of our ability. So speedrunning is an optimization problem at its core, right? It's what is the most optimal way to go from one point to another point to achieve a goal. But because we know that there's no perfection, there's also a risk reward that goes into this too, right? We come up against what we can actually do, what we can actually perform in our limited time. And part of that is the fact that we're glitched, the game is glitched, and we need to accept that. And then we put the glitches, we operationalize glitches towards that kind of goal and for that optimization. So I think there's that key distinction between optimal and perfect, where perfect is like this platonic ideal whereas optimal is the best we can do in our physical bodies in a certain amount of time. And I think that's really speaks to the things that I'm kind of talking about related to glitching, right? The way that we accept it, we work with it, and we find new ways to be glitched as a community and off the work and labor that other people have done. Does that speak to any of the kind of thoughts you're having?
Yeah, no, completely and totally. I mean, I'm fascinated with the idea of like thinking about so does optimization allow for freedom and creativity, or is optimization another set of rules and routines that direct play?
That's where the glitch comes in. There's always a way to be more optimal, and that's where the creativity comes in. The lateral thinking, the thinking about what are the other ways we could approach this, or what are the other ways that are safer to approach this. There's many things. Player expression is a term that's used in speedrunning communities because it looks like a very rigid kind of, we're going from one point to another and there's a best way to do it. But really, you'll notice the very fine-toothed differences in players. When I watch players of a game that I'm very, very, very familiar with, I know who it is, whether I see it or not. I see the very small differences in their play because we can't know what's perfect. And also, we're, again, bodies in meat space here, pressing buttons. We're going to have habits. We're going to have routines. So I don't think so. I think it's good to hold on to the fact that optimize doesn't necessarily negate these tiny glitches that keep cropping up, whether it's small, minute changes in pathing, disagreements on what might be the actual best way to do a thing, and on, and maybe even just finding a completely different route. It's happened so many times where people know a route inside out. They've practiced it for years. Shit, we found a game-breaking glitch. All of that goes out the window. Happened with Ocarina of Time, which was that the poem was referencing many, many times. All the skills that you thought you had, goodbye, someone found a different way to do it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that these things change over time, even though optimization might hint, like initially kind of gesture at that. I think there's a lot more nuance to it than that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Ray. If no one else has a question or wants to jump in real quick, I'll ask my question. Madison, so one, thank you so much for this really, really awesome talk. As I said earlier, my question, I think I'd like to just maybe for a moment sort of move away from sort of, as you call it, the technical cultural practice of speedrunning, but still thinking about sort of the intersection between sort of player desire and video games. I'm curious if you thought any in your work, or if you'd be willing to sort of think out loud now about the way sort of and the way and consequences sort of game developers, especially sort of AAA game developers, have sort of using now and have been using sort of the idea of gender choice as a sort of ludic mechanic for freedom, right? The logic is that the player has the freedom to choose where they are in a very specific binary, right? So I'm curious, one, just sort of, and then sort of thinking sort of alongside sort of the controversies with, like, sort of, for example, like Cyberpunk 2077 or whatever the number is, and their sort of issues with sort of transness in their game, right? Thinking about sort of the Conan, I think, MMO that was sort of had people sort of spamming penis and breast size for their characters, right? So I feel like I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I'm curious if you could sort of maybe talk a little bit more about sort of what I think that the novel thing about your work is that it sort of undoes the fallacy that sort of that opting into a binary, right, is actually free, right? But yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So I guess just your last comment there, the fact that choice, right? Oh, we're given the choice of like, but yeah, but that is a limiting feature that limits it to two options. Yeah, well, hold on. Cyberpunk 2077, I, maybe shockingly, loved at launch. Why did I love it? It was glitchy as all hell. It didn't work. So any of these kinds of things that anyone was talking about as far as what was inscribed by the developers, your choice is as good as your guess is as good as mine. My character is now at the skybox of, even though I was driving in a car for some reason, now I'm falling. Like, who cares? This whole world is like deconstructed in certain ways. So I think that's like an interesting example. At the same time, there's that like mixing and matching of these different kind of sexed and gendered features that they tried to allow. And like, I don't know. I think you're already kind of touched on what my thinking would be, right? Regarding kind of player desire and the limits of the designed kind of interaction with this. Because this has to be taken, like, once you're talking about this, there's also a critique of kind of a larger capitalist structure of what the gaming audience has been constructed as, who the kind of consumer, because the consuming audience is constructed in certain ways. It's been historically constructed to be a particular person, how, like, what they're able to do within those constraints. I guess I don't have too many thoughts. I think the Conan thing is hilarious. I love that they give the option to have these over, like, if your desire is to have this huge, enormous breasts or penis, that the game allows you to do that. And I think really directly of the McElroy's brothers, Monster Factory. If you're not aware, Griffin and Justin McElroy, who were kind of founding, I don't know, they're a major in getting Polygon off the ground, have a series on YouTube called Monster Factory, where they take character creators and they break them. They just break them to all hell. Their motto is no middle sliders. Okay. And there's exaggerated features. There's silly, bulbous heads. There's all these things that like take a body and reveal that even in these character creators that maybe they are gendered along a binary, we can just fuck with that thing to all hell and back if we want to and create whatever we want. The features that the character creators are often extremely powerful, and the designers don't anticipate you to use them all. That is how I would kind of connect my like research to what you're talking about. Well, what can we actually do with these? Who cares what they actually think? Who cares what the label male and female says on the tin? What can we actually produce through these character creators would be how I would want to like look into this and analyze. I super recommend Monster Factory. Check some of those out and see the kind of wild quote unquote monsters that they create, which I love that they use the term monster because there's also like a care and a narrative that they give to all the characters, that they're monsters, they're glitches by kind of cultural convention, but they're these like endearing creatures that they play games with then. That's what pops into my mind.
Thank you so much, Madison, for that thoughtful answer on the fly. I really appreciate it.